The Galaxy Council froze when the human said just 3 words. The ship was built for a species with 4 arms. Mara Voss had jury-rigged the seat with cargo webbing before the transit even cleared Earth's orbital dock. The straps were too wide, the back was too tall. The entire cockpit smelled like something between engine oil and a chemical she had no name for, something that made the back of her throat feel like it was being politely warned. She tightened the webbing, she sat down. She opened her thermos. Outside the viewport, the stars moved. The way they always did out here, too. Many of them, in arrangements that still felt wrong after 6 years of deep space postings. Back home, the stars over Lake Michigan had gaps, comfortable dark between them. Out here, the dark had been crowded out. She drank her coffee. The Veth diplomatic attaché assigned to escort her was standing near the far wall of the transit cabin doing that thing. She had noticed it on every Veth she had ever met. They observed humans the way structural engineer observes a building that should have collapsed 3 times and somehow has not with hostility, not with warmth, with a kind of careful, professional confusion. His name, translated into something she could say, was Arbiter Liaison Sieve. She had been calling him Sieve in her head since they boarded. He had not corrected her because she suspected he did not know she was doing it. The transit will reach Council space in approximately 14 of your hours, Sieve said. His voice carried those layered harmonics that Veth speech always carried. Her translator rendered it flat. She was glad. You have been provided the formal agenda for the civilizational review session. Have you reviewed it? 3 times, she said. Do you have questions? She looked at the viewport. Not yet. He went quiet in that very particular Veth way that was not actually quiet, because even their silence had a low harmonic to it, a hum below. Hearing that, she felt more in her back teeth than her ears. She had read the summons document 11 times. She knew what a civilizational review was. The Council of 11 Species had been running them since before humans had figured out that fire could be carried. When a younger species began moving through galactic space in ways the Council found unpredictable, they called a civilizational review. It was not a trial technically. It had never, in 4,000 years of recorded galactic history, resulted in the destruction of the reviewed species. It had twice resulted in quarantine. The last species quarantined had been the Drev 300 years ago. The Drev were now one of humanity's closest allies, which was one of the things on the Council's list of grievances. Mara finished her coffee. She screwed the cap back on the thermos with the slow care of someone who had learned not to rush her hands in low-gravity environments. Outside, the stars kept crowding each other. She was the sole human delegate on this transport, no fleet escort. That was protocol for a civilizational review. You arrived as a representative, not a force. You sat in the room. You listened. You responded. She had received the summons, called her superior, Colonel Dan Reeves, on a channel so secure it took 4 authentication cycles to open. He had told her it was her call. She was the senior diplomat. He had said it in the tone of a man who was relieved the decision was not his and trying not to show it. She had packed 1 bag. The transit moved through a corridor of space she recognized by the color of the light out the viewport. It shifted here In this particular region, from the standard white of deep space to something the Veth called the breath of the outer field, a faint amber wash across everything that made the hull look older than it was. She had passed through this corridor once before, not as a delegate. She did not look at the region of space. To the far left of the viewport, she already knew what was there. She had counted it once, and once was enough. 14 hours is a long time to sit with a thermos and the specific quality of silence that comes when you are the only human in a very large and very alien ship. Mara had spent longer in worse places. She pulled a paper notebook from her bag and began writing, not notes, not preparation materials, names. She wrote names the way other people might count prayers quietly without ceremony. She had 2,400 of them, and she did not always finish the list in one sitting, but she always started from the beginning. She wrote until her coffee ran out. Siv watched her from across the cabin. For a long time, she could feel the harmonic of his observation changing, shifting into something that was not quite curiosity and not quite discomfort. She had cataloged enough Veth reactions to read the shift. He was trying to understand what she was doing. She did not explain it. When the transit came out of its final fold and council space opened up ahead, she capped her pen, closed the notebook, and looked out the viewport. The council station was enormous in the way that things built over 4,000 years by 11 different species tend to be. Enormous, not uniformly, not elegantly, but in the way of a city that has grown without a plan, each new piece added by a different set of hands with a different idea of what up means. It sprawled. It reached in directions that felt almost argumentative. In the docking bay, 20 ships from 9 different species sat in their berths. Myra counted them, old habit. Siv came to stand beside her. Is this your first visit to the central station? No, she said. He waited for more. I was here for the Kepler Inquiry 6 years ago. She paused, as a witness. She picked up her bag. She put the thermos in the front pocket. She moved toward the docking hatch. Behind her, she heard Siv's harmonic shift again, that deeper dissonance sound of a Veth who has just placed a piece of information into a context it does not fit cleanly and is not sure what to do with the remainder. She did not turn around. The hatch opened. The docking bay air came in cold and layered with the atmospheric settings of 9 different species, none of them tuned for humans. She breathed it in anyway. The council of 11 species was waiting. Myra Vass walked in. The chamber of the council had been designed, she was fairly certain, by someone who disliked the concept of a person feeling comfortable. 11 tiers of architectural ambition rose toward a light source she had no name for, something above and beyond the ceiling that poured down in a color that changed depending on where you stood. From her position on the floor, it was white gold. The cyan delegates from their tier near the back sat in what she guessed was a deep violet. Each species got the light they thrived under. The floor where human delegates stood was lit in standard fluorescent white. She noted this without expression. 11 delegations had arrived with retinues, translators, cultural liaisons, legal teams in robes or carapaces, or the architectural exoskeletal armor that the caste species used for formal occasions. The tunnel people of Meridian had sent 3 representatives in matching gray stone cloth that Myra had only seen once Before, at a funeral, she had arrived with a thermos and a notebook. Her chair at the floor-level delegate station had been adjusted, she saw immediately that someone had tried. Armrests had been moved wider, a human standard atmospheric setting had been programmed into the small panel on the desk. There was a cup holder. Someone had thought about her comfort. Specifically, she sat down without acknowledging it. She opened her notebook to a blank page. Owen Marsh, her aide, had arrived separately via the civilian transit and was seated in the observer gallery above the main floor. She had looked for him when she entered and found him in the third row, young, 22, from Bristol, still carrying that particular expression of someone who has read every book about space and is now discovering that the books left several things out. He saw her look. He nodded once. She nodded back. The session opened with the formal harmonics of convening, a Veth tradition that had been adopted council-wide 3,000 years ago. It lasted 4 minutes and involved every species present producing their version of a sustained low tone simultaneously. The result was something that started as noise and resolved somewhere in the middle of the second minute into something that was genuinely difficult to hear and not feel in your sternum. Myra sat through it. When it ended, the Veth arbiter, the senior voice of the council, rose to speak. She had read his translated name in the briefing documents in English. The closest approximation was arbiter. First Kale. He was tall, bioluminescent at the joints, and moved with the specific unhurried certainty of someone who had never once been late to anything. The charges were read. Count 1 landed without ceremony. Unsanctioned species alliances. Humanity had, in the 22 years since formal galactic integration, formed 37 distinct alliance agreements with species not recognized by the Council as full members. The Drev, the moth builders of Cass IV, the tunnel people of Meridian, who were sitting in the gallery right now in their stone cloth and had not been told this was being listed as a violation. Myra wrote the number 37 in her notebook. Kale continued. The alliances had been formed outside Council framework, without review, without the standard integration assessment that Council law required, before species of different developmental tiers entered into binding agreements. Humanity had in effect been making its own rules about who qualified as a person worth partnering with. The Council recognizes, Kale said, his harmonics carrying a register that her translator flagged as formal neutral, that these alliances were formed in the spirit of cooperation. However, the mechanism by which they were formed undermines the foundation structure of civilizational governance. Myra underlined the word governance, not because it surprised her, because it was the word that always showed up when a larger group wanted to explain why a smaller group's choices were wrong. Count 2. Warfare conventions. She had been expecting this one. The armistice rhythms were woven into every council recognized military code. They had been codified 2,000 years ago, after a war between the Saiyan and the Veth that had lasted 300 years longer than it needed to because neither side had a framework for pausing the rhythms, built-in rest cycles, negotiation, windows, and what the Council called civilizational breathing room periods. During a conflict where both sides stood down, restocked, and allowed their wounded to be collected, Humanity had been informed of the rhythms at integration. Humanity had continued fighting through them, not out of malice. That was the part the charges struggled to convey. Mara had read the original military reports. Human commanders in the 3 minor territorial conflicts since integration had simply not understood that their opponents expected them to stop. The concept of a scheduled pause in combat was so foreign to human military training that the first time a VETH field commander had signaled the armistice rhythm during the Margin 9 engagement, the human battalion had assumed it was a trap. They had pressed forward. They had taken the position. They had won. The VETH field commander's report described the experience as encountering a force with no concept of enough. Kale read this line without inflection. Myra wrote "no concept of enough" in her notebook and looked at the words for a long moment. Count 3 came in a different tone. The arbiter's harmonics shifted into something her translator flagged as formal concerned. She had never seen that flag before. The charge was psychological contamination. She listened carefully. Human grief practices, specifically the tradition of naming each individual casualty, building physical memorials, holding public ceremonies of mourning, had been observed by allied species, and it produced what the Council described as significant and unplanned psychological effects. The Drev had watched humans conduct memorial services for the dead at the Battle of Margin 9. They had watched. For 3 hours, they had returned to their ships. They had remained in a state of collective mourning for 21 days. Drev Command had filed a formal report. Not a complaint, a report. They wanted the Council to understand what they had seen because they had no framework for it. Every species the Council recognized grieved collectively in their own way, but always as a unit. The losses absorbed into the whole. Humans grieved each individual as if the whole were made of individuals, as if the loss of one were not a reduction of the group but the elimination of something that could not be replaced by the group's continuation. The Drev had no word for this. They had watched and they had felt something they could not name, and they had been 3 weeks finding their way back to functional. Myra did not move while this was read. Owen in the gallery had leaned forward. She could see it from the floor without looking directly at him. She had good peripheral vision, old habit. Kale continued. The tunnel people of Meridian had constructed a permanent memorial to the Kepler colony dead, without being requested to do so, without compensation, without any diplomatic communication preceding the act. They had simply done it because they had learned what happened and believed the dead should be named in stone. The memorial used 47 different terms from their own language, none of which translated directly, but which a VETH linguist had rendered approximately as those who were here and are not and should not be forgotten and will not be. The Council's concern was not that the memorial existed. The concern was the effect species that had not previously engaged with human grief practices were developing what psychological assessments called empathic destabilization. They were beginning to count their own dead individually. They were asking for names. This Council does not suggest, Kale said carefully, that human grief practices are wrong. It suggests they are destabilizing, and that destabilization of allied species psychological frameworks constitutes form of civilizational contamination. Mara looked at him. He looked back. Count 4 was delivered more carefully. Still, biological adaptation, 4 generations of spacefaring humans had already produced measurable physiological variation across colonial populations. Nothing dramatic, slightly increased visual range in low-light environments among Kepler origin families, marginally denser bone structure among the high-gravity settlements of the outer reaches, minor shifts in how human bodies process certain atmospheric compounds, 4 generations, 40 in any other species. The Veth biologist whose report was being quoted had used the phrase aggressive cellular responsiveness. The council had flagged it as an anomaly. They were not sure what it meant long-term, and that uncertainty was its own kind of concern. Kale set down the formal documents. He looked at Mara the way a person looks at a puzzle they have been handed and told is solvable, but remain genuinely unsure. Does the human delegate wish to respond to any charge before deliberation begins? The chamber was quiet. 11 species, 4,000 years of civilizational weight in the room. The light above was white gold. Where she sat, Owen was very still in the gallery. She looked at Kale for a long moment. She picked up her thermos. No, she said, keep going. A harmonic passed through the room that her translator did not render in words. It rendered it in a note at the bottom of her screen, tone category unknown. She wrote that down too. The recess was called at the 3rd hour. Mara was shown to a diplomatic holding suite 2 corridors from the main chamber. It was a room built to accommodate any of 11 species, which meant it accommodated none of them well. There were 11 different atmospheric setting options on the wall panel. She set it to human standard, sat down in a chair that was almost the right height, and opened her bag. Owen arrived 8 minutes later. He came in carrying a small bag from the transit ship's food supply station, the kind with protein packs and electrolyte tablets, and set it on the table with the expression of someone who has decided that doing something practical is better than figuring out what to say. Good call, she said. He sat across from her. She ate the protein pack. It tasted like something between cardboard and a polite apology. The atmospheric setting hummed at human standard, and for the first time since boarding the transit ship back home, she could breathe without the back of her throat sending low-level alerts. They read all 4 counts without letting you speak, Owen said. That is how it works. You said no to responding. I did. He looked at the table. He was 22 and smart, and had graduated top of his cohort from the diplomatic corps training program, and had been assigned to her because his supervisors thought exposure to a senior delegate would accelerate his development. He had been with her for 4 months. He had learned in those 4 months to wait when she was thinking, and to not ask questions he already knew part of the answer to. He was learning the 3rd thing now, which was harder. He was learning that sometimes the absence of a reaction is the whole reaction. The contamination charge, he said. What about it? They called our grief practices destabilizing. They did. And the Drev 3 weeks. Yes. He turned his cup of water in both hands. Is that a bad thing that the Drev cried for 3 weeks? She looked at him. She thought about how to answer the question without answering. More than the question, Owen was smart. He would carry whatever she said, and he would carry it for a long time. She was careful about what she gave people to carry. No, she said. He nodded slowly, because they never had a reason to before. Because nobody ever showed them it was allowed. He was quiet for a moment, then in the biological adaptation count 4 generations, she refilled her thermos from the hot water dispenser on the wall. It was not quite right for coffee, but it was close enough. They expected 40. Why are we faster? She looked at him, he looked back. Young, serious, from Bristol, still with that expression of someone who wants to understand things fully and has not yet learned that full understanding is sometimes a door that takes years to open. Because we come from a place where slow meant gone, she said. Our planet tried to remove us about a dozen times. Ice, heat, disease, each other. She screwed the cap on the thermos. We adapted. Because we had to. You adapt fast when the alternative is not adapting. And now we're doing it in space. We brought the habit with us. Owen turned his water cup again. He had a tell that cup when he was processing something large. He worked it in his hands. The warfare violations, he said. Owen, I know you explained it in the briefing document. Then you know. I want to hear you say it. She looked at him for a moment. He was not being stubborn. He was doing the thing young people do when they want the information to come from a person instead of a document, because a person carries weight that paper does not. We did not stop fighting, she said, because we learned to fight in conditions where stopping meant losing everything. Our ancestors fought in cold. That should have ended them. They fought at night. They fought when they were hurt and when their allies were gone and when the ground was working against them. She drank from the thermos. The armistice rhythm is a rule made by species who learned to fight after they already had enough to eat and a place to sleep. The pause made sense to them. We come from before the pause made sense. Owen sat with that. So every charge, he said slowly, is basically the council saying we do things they do not understand. Every charge is the council saying we do things that make them uncomfortable. Because we are too fast, too persistent. He searched for the word. Thorough, she said, about the things that matter. He nodded. He looked at the table. He turned the cup. Then he looked up. Are you scared? The question sat in the air between them, simple, direct, the kind of question only someone who does not know better or cares too much to pretend asks out loud. She held the thermos in both hands. It was warm. She had been doing that, holding warm things, since long before she understood why. I survived Kepler, she said. He waited. Scared, stopped working on me a long time ago. She said it the way she said most things, flat level, in the register of someone stating a fact about the weather. Over Lake Michigan, she did not say it to be impressive, and she did not say it to end the conversation. She said it because it was true, and because true was the only register she operated in. Owen looked at her for a long moment. Something moved through his expression. Not pity, she would have felt pity differently, but something closer to the look people get when they understand a thing they previously only knew. The distinction between knowing and understanding is not small. He looked down at his water cup. He did not say anything for a while. She let him be quiet. She drank her coffee adjacent hot water and listened to the atmospheric system run at human standard and felt, for the first time in 14 hours, that her lungs had the right amount of room. The alliances, he said, finally count. One, they called them unsanctioned. Yes. But the Drev, the tunnel people, they moth builders. Yes. Those are our friends. She looked at him. Yes. The council calls them pre-civilizational lesser species. The council calls them that. He shook his head, not in anger, in the way of someone reorganizing a room they thought they knew. The tunnel people built a memorial to our dead without being asked, without payment, because they thought it was right. Yes. And that is a violation. She stood up. She rolled her shoulders. She moved to the window, which looked out onto an interior corridor of the station, all those species moving past, all those different ways of walking and flowing and processing existence. The council built their civilization on a ranking system, she said. Some species are ready, some are not. The ones who are not yet ready get observed and assessed, and eventually, when they meet the requirements, they get integrated. She watched a Veth official pass in the corridor below. It is a clean system. It makes sense if you believe that readiness is something you can measure from the outside. And we do not believe that. We do not know how to believe that. She turned from the window. We come from a planet where the person next to you in a hard moment is your ally, regardless of whether they have a space program. You earn alliance by showing up. The tunnel people showed up. Owen was quiet again. Then so what do we do? She picked up her bag. She checked the thermos was properly sealed. She straightened her jacket, which was the human diplomatic standard, charcoal gray, no ornament chosen specifically, because it carried none of the ceremonial weight that other species formal wear did, and she had decided a long time ago that a human who showed up in borrowed ceremony was a human who had already started losing. We go back in, she said. And then she looked at him. And then I do what I came here to do. He nodded. He stood. He was taller than her, young, still carrying the look of someone who wants to understand things fully. She hoped he still had that look in 10 years. She stepped into the corridor. The chamber looked different on return. She could not have explained why. The light was the same. The 11 tiers were the same. The Scion delegate sat in the same position with the same bioluminescent stillness, but something in the air had changed during the recess, a shift in atmospheric pressure. That probably meant 3 different species had adjusted their environmental settings, but which felt in the way that rooms feel, things like anticipation. Mara sat down. She opened her notebook. Kale returned to the council floor with the movement of someone who has been in deliberation and has come back carrying a decision. She recognized the shift in his harmonics before he said a word. She had been around enough Veth to know the difference between the sound of someone who is about to ask a question and the sound of someone who is about to deliver an answer. The council has completed its preliminary review, Kale began. Before the session proceeds to formal deliberation on terms, the council offers the human delegate an opportunity to address the record. She looked up from her notebook. That is new, she said. It is a provision added to the Civilizational Review Framework 40 years ago, Kale said. following a review in which the council determined after the fact that the assessed species had relevant context that was not entered into the record, it was considered a corrective measure. Which species was it? A pause, the harmonic in the room shifted. The Drev. She wrote that down. She addressed the record. She spoke for 7 minutes. She did not raise her voice. She did not use formal, diplomatic language. She used the language she used when she was explaining something true to someone who needed to hear it and not be impressed by it. She explained the alliances first, not as violations, as the behavior of a species that learned before it left its own planet that survival is a collective project. You do not assess whether your neighbor is ready for your help before you give it. You help. You build the relationship. You make the agreement. The council's framework was logical. It was also built by species who had, for most of their history, never been in genuine danger of disappearing. Framework assumed there was always time. Humanity had not historically had time. She explained the warfare violations. She was brief. The concept of a scheduled pause in combat was not something that could be taught in a briefing document to a species whose ancestors had fought through the harshest winters on a hostile planet with nothing but their own endurance as an advantage. The armistice rhythms required a fundamental understanding that the conflict would resume on agreed terms. Humans did not assume resumption. They assumed the moment you stopped was the moment you lost. That assumption had been wrong in some contexts. It had been survival in others. She explained the grief practices last. She was slower here. Human grief practices were individual, because human communities were structured around the individual as the irreducible unit, not the family, not the species, the person. Each person was, to the humans around them, a world. When a world ended, you named it, you built something, you made sure it was not forgotten, because forgetting was the second loss, and the second loss was the one that could be prevented. The Drev had watched them do this and had cried for 3 weeks. That is not contamination, she said. That is recognition. She closed her notebook. Kale looked at her with that careful, professional confusion she was used to seeing on Veth faces. The council appreciates the context provided. The council has not asked my question yet, she said. A pause. 11 species on 11 tiers. The light above her was white gold. You may ask. She set down her pen. Who authorized the Kepler survey? The silence was immediate, total. The kind of silence that does not arrive gradually but appears all at once, like a light being switched off. She continued. The military survey, conducted 4 years before the Sign fleet came through the outer Kepler system, the survey that mapped the colony's position, its population count, its defensive capacity, its proximity to the route that the Sign fleet was logged to travel. She paused. The survey that was filed in Veth archive storage, stamped, dated, and classified under routine observation. Kale's harmonics had gone very still. We found it 7 months ago, she said. Our archival team, they were looking for something else. They found a Veth survey document from the standard pre-review period, routine as noted, logged by a council observation post, reviewed by council administrative staff, filed. She let that sit. 2,400 people, she said. We had been in the colony for 11 years. we had built. Schools, we had mapped the local. Geology, we had started figuring out which crops grew in that soil. 2,400 people and a council survey team mapped their position 4 years before a hostile fleet came through, and nobody raised a flag. The chamber was very still. Owen was in the gallery. She did not look at him. She could feel him anyway. The specific quality of stillness that comes from a person trying very hard not to move. The council is not obligated to protect species that have not completed integration, Kale said. His voice was steady, professionally steady. Steadiness of someone who has reached for a prepared answer. At the time of the Kepler incident, humanity's integration status was provisional. The colony was outside the protected zone under council law. I know that, she said. Then you understand that the council was not in violation of any framework. I know that too. She picked up her thermos. She held it in both hands. The warmth came through the metal into her palms in the way that it always did, steady, constant, reliable in the way of small things that are entirely in your control. I am not here to argue legality, she said. The council acted within its framework. You saw a survey, you knew the fleet trajectory, you knew the colony position, you calculated the probable outcome, you filed it under routine observation, and you waited to see what a young species would do when it broke. The harmonics in the room shifted. Several species simultaneously. Her translator ran 3 flags at once, and she did not look at the screen. That is not an accurate characterization, Kale said. No, she agreed, it is a simplified one. The full characterization would take longer, and the conclusion would be the same. She set the thermos on the desk. Sound was small. You watched, we broke. And then we did not break the way you expected. Silence. What did you expect? She asked. No one answered. Did you expect us to retreat, to consolidate to the inner colonies, to petition the council for protection and demonstrate the kind of institutional dependence that would make integration easier to manage? She looked at Kale. Did you expect us to be persuaded into cooperation by laws? Kale's harmonics were at a register her translator had no word for. What we did, she said, was go back to Kepler. We recovered the site. We documented every casualty. We named them individually on a public record. We built a memorial. We put it in every school. And then we formed alliances with the Drev and the Moth Builders and the Tunnel people who had all had their own versions of being in the path of something large and being told the framework did not yet cover them. She closed her notebook. And then the council called a civilizational review, she said, and listed all of it as violations. A long pause. Owen had not moved in the gallery. She could feel that too. The council acted within its framework, Kale said again. His voice was the same, steady, professional, the prepared answer again, but the harmonic underneath it had changed. Veth. Harmonics were honest in a way there. Words sometimes were not. The harmonic underneath his steady voice was something her translator flagged after a 3-second delay as unresolved. I know, she said. I am not disputing that. Then, what is the human delegate's position? She looked at him. She looked at the 11 tears. She looked at the cyan delegate in their deep violet light and the Canel people in their stone cloth and The Drev representative, who had been watching her since she entered the room, with an expression that, on a Drev face, she had learned to read as intense, careful attention. She thought about Gary, she thought about Lake Michigan in January, the way the water looked when it half froze, gray and white and completely indifferent to everything. She thought about Kepler. She thought about what it means to count things, to name them, to write them down, so they cannot be forgotten. She thought about a species that had come from ice and fire and shortage, and built itself into something that crossed the stars in jury-rigged ships with thermoses full of coffee and notebooks full of names, and had arrived in a room full of civilizations 4,000 years older, and had somehow, against every expectation, not broken. The council offered an ultimatum. She said, cease the alliances, adopt the rhythms, stop the grief practices, or accept quarantine. That is correct. I have a response. The council is prepared to receive it. She stood up. The chamber was quiet in the specific way it had been quiet since she said the word Kepler and watched Cale's harmonics go still. Not the quiet of emptiness, the quiet of 11 species collectively holding something in, waiting to see if what came next would require them to move. Marva stood at the floor-level delegate station of the Council of 11 Species and looked at Arbiter First Cale and thought briefly about the first time she had stood in this chamber. She had been 32. She had come as a witness. She had sat where Owen was sitting now, and she had answered questions for 4 hours in a voice she kept carefully flat while the Council Inquiry Team documented the Kepler incident in language so clean and clinical it barely resembled what had actually happened. She had counted 2,400 names before boarding that ship. She had counted them again on the way home. She counted them now, not all of them, but the weight of them, which was something she carried in her chest, in the specific place where people carry things they have chosen not to put down. Owen was in the gallery. She did not look at him. She did not need to. She looked at Cale. Before I respond to the ultimatum, she said, I want to make sure we understand each other, not diplomatically. Actually, Cale's harmonics did not shift. He was listening. The council has existed for 4,000 years, she said. 11 species. Civilizational framework that has governed 600 worlds. You have managed interspecies conflict, resource allocation, biological contamination, events, and 3 separate extinction level threats in recorded history. You are by any measure the most successful governing structure in this part of the galaxy. She picked up her notebook. She looked at the 4 charges she had written down, 1, 2, 3, 4, in a neat column on the first page. And in 61 years of humanity being part of this community, she said, you have not once asked us where we came from. She set the notebook back down. Not where in space, where in the development of a species, what made us, what it cost. The Drev representative was watching with the kind of attention that animals use when they recognize something. You surveyed us, Mara continued. You measured us. You tracked our adaptation rate and our alliance behavior and our grief practices, and you filed it all under routine observation. You watched us break a Kepler, and you documented the pieces, and you built a case from what you saw without asking what it meant. Cale said, the council's assessment protocols are designed to observe behavior without introducing the Potential for coached responses. I know, she said, that is a reasonable protocol for studying something you believe cannot understand it as being studied. She looked at him. We knew. We have known for 20 years that we were being assessed. Our behavioral scientists identified the council's observation pattern in the second decade of integration. She paused. We did not tell you we knew. We kept behaving the same way we had always behaved because it was not a performance, it was just us. The Scion delegate's bioluminescence shifted. Subtle. She noted it. The alliances, she said, count one. The council calls them unsanctioned. I will tell you what they are. They are what happens when a species that learned on its home planet that the person next to you is your ally regardless of their status looks around a galaxy and finds other species who have been told they are not ready, not integrated, not developed enough to matter at the table, and decides that framework is wrong. She looked along the tiers. The Drev were quarantined for a generation because the council assessed their conflict resolution methods as too aggressive. The moth builders of Cass IV have been in integration review for 90 years because their social structure does not translate cleanly into council legal categories. The tunnel people of Meridian built monument to our dead because someone told them what happened and they recognized it. She let that word sit. Recognized. Those are not lesser species, she said. Those are species the council has not found convenient yet. The harmonic in the room shifted. Multiple sources. Count two, she continued, the warfare violations. You want us to adopt the armistice rhythms. I want to ask you something about that. She looked at Kale. The rhythms were codified 2,000 years ago to prevent conflicts from becoming total, to build in the pauses that allow for negotiation. I understand the purpose. I respect the purpose. She placed her hand flat on the desk. Tell me the last time a council species fought for survival, not territory, not resources, not ideological alignment. Survival, the kind where if you stop, you end. No answer. Because we have records, she said. Not old records. We have 3 colony incidents in the last 40 years where human settlements were in genuine survival level threat, and the armistice rhythm signal was sent by opposing forces, and our people did not recognize it as anything other than a tactical maneuver because in a survival fight, a pause is a trap. Every instinct we have says so. She withdrew her hand. You want us to overwrite 40,000 years of survival behavior with a 2,000-year rule made by species who have not been in a survival fight in longer than that. I am telling you what that costs. I am telling you we are trying. I am telling you it is not as simple as being told. Kale was still. Count 3, she said, the grief. She stopped for a moment. She looked at the Drev representative. The Drev representative looked back with that complete still attention. You called it contamination, she said. I want to use a different word. She opened the notebook to the page with the names, the first page of them, the first 40 written in her handwriting, small and even. She held it up for a moment, not for dramatic effect, because the chamber was too wide for most of the council to read it, but because the act of holding it meant something to her, and she had stopped making apologies for the things that meant something to her a long time ago. She lowered the notebook. The Drev watched us and they cried for 3 weeks, she said. You call that Destabilization, I call that the first time someone showed them that each person in the count is a world, and it changed something in them that needed to be changed. She looked at Kale. You want us to stop? I am here to tell you we are not going to stop, not because we cannot, because it is true. And we do not know how to do things that are not true. The chamber held 11 species. The light above her was white gold. She thought about the Kepler debris field. She thought about the transit window she had not looked through. She thought about the notebook in her hands and the 40 names on the first page, and the 2,360 on the pages after. She thought about Kale's prepared answer, used twice now, the framework, the protocol, the legal structure that made everything the council had done and had not done technically correct. She thought about what it means to be technically correct. She thought about her mother, who had grown up in Gary, Indiana in the decade after the steel mills closed, and who had fed a family of 4 on a salary that should not have fed 2, and who had never once used the word survive as a verb, because for her it was not a thing you did, it was simply the shape of a day. She thought about all of it, and then she put it down. Not a way down, like setting a weight on a table rather than continuing to carry it. The weight was still there. It would always be there, but she could choose in this moment what she picked up next. She looked at Kale. She looked at 11 tiers of 4,000 civilization. She looked at the Drev representative, who was looking at her with that total attention that she had learned to read as something close to hope. She said 3 words. We forgive you. The freeze was total. It was not a figure of speech. She watched it happen in real time. Kale's harmonics went completely silent, thing she had never seen in a Veth in full formal session. The sound simply stopped, as if the production mechanism had encountered an input it had no process for. The cyan delegate's bioluminescence went dark, not dim dark. The 2 CAS IV representatives turned to each other in a movement so identical it had to be involuntary. The tunnel people sat very still in their stone cloth, with their hands open on their knees. Somewhere above her in the gallery, Owen made a sound. She did not turn to look. She let the 3 words sit in the room and do what 3 words will do when they are the ones that nobody expected. After a moment, she continued. That is our response to the Kepler survey, to the routine observation, filing, to the calculation that was made, and the flag that was not raised, and the 2,400 people who were in the path of something the council knew was coming. She kept her voice level, not cold. Level, the distinction was important. We are not going into conflict with the council over it. We are not withdrawing from galactic integration. We are not making demands or filing countercharges or using it as leverage in negotiations. She placed her hands flat on the desk. We forgive you. Kale's harmonics returned slowly in a register she had never heard before. Her translator ran 3 flags and then gave up and rendered the whole thing as no category available. That is not, he said carefully, standard diplomatic response. No, she agreed. Forgiveness implies, he said, and stopped. He reorganized. In council diplomatic language, forgiveness is a term used in legal frameworks to indicate the suspension of a grievance in exchange for a specific remedy. What remedy is the human delegate requesting? She looked at him. None. The harmonic in the room changed again. Multiple sources. She was past tracking. Individual species. That is not how forgiveness functions. Cale said. That is how it functions for us, she said. We forgive you because we have chosen to, not because you asked not. Because you offered remedy, not because. It is strategic, because we have 2,400 names in a notebook and we have been carrying them for a long time and we are tired of waiting for you to understand what they mean, so we are putting that part down. She looked along the 11 tiers. Now let me tell you what we are not putting down. She opened her notebook to a new page. We are not ending the alliances with the Drev or the Moth Builders or the Tunnel people. Those are our allies. They have earned the name, and we do not unearn things. She looked at Cale. If the council wants to call that a violation, it can call it a violation. We are not stopping. A harmonic of protest rose from the third tier, the Veth secondary delegation. She waited for it to settle. We are not adopting the armistice rhythms in full, not yet, not as a unilateral requirement. We are prepared to open a working dialogue on how to develop a modified framework that accounts for the genuine biological and historical reasons human military behavior differs from council standard. We are willing to work on it. We are not willing to be told it is simple when it is not simple. She wrote a note in the notebook. That is a reasonable position. The protest harmonic did not return. And we are not stopping the grief practices, she said, not ever, not for any reason, diplomatic or otherwise. She looked at the Drev representative. He was watching her with that total still attention, because the Drev cried for 3 weeks, and that was not contamination. That was the most significant thing that happened in this chamber's history, and nobody filed it correctly. The Drev representative made a sound. Her translator rendered it as affirmation, deep register. She looked back at Cale. We forgive you, she said again, not for emphasis, not as a rhetorical tool, because it needed to be said twice, once to be heard and once to be believed. We forgive you because that is what we do. With things we cannot undo, we name them, we count them, we build something, so they are not forgotten. And then we decide what kind of species we want to be on the other side of them. Cale looked at her for a long time. His harmonics were in a register she had never heard and could not classify in. Did not need to classify. Some things did not need a category. The council will need to deliberate, he said. Take your time, she said. This response introduces parameters the framework does not have precedent for. I know. Forgiveness, as you have defined it, suggests the human delegation holds a grievance that it is voluntarily releasing without seeking remedy. This creates an asymmetric record that the council has no established mechanism for processing. Then build one, she said. You have 4,000 years of precedent, add to it. She picked up her bag, she picked up her thermos. She straightened her jacket. We came here as the new species, she said. The young ones, the ones who do not follow the rules and do not schedule their grief and do not stop fighting at the right times and who keep making friends you have not approved yet. She looked at the room one last time. We are all of that. We are also the species that came back to Kepler and counted every piece and named every person and built a memorial and went home and kept going. She moved toward the door. Figure out what to do with all of it. Together, that is what this council is. 4. She walked out. The door closed behind her. In the chamber, the silence lasted 11 minutes, she knew because Owen timed it. He told her afterward in the corridor. Still with that particular expression on his face, the one she had hoped he would keep, the one that meant he had understood something fully instead of just knowing it. She handed him the thermos. Refill that, she said. There is a hot water station 2 corridors back. He looked at her, something moved through his face that she did not have a word for and did not need one. He took the thermos. She leaned against the wall of the corridor and looked at the ceiling, which was a completely unremarkable council station ceiling, paneled in the Veth architectural style, functional and slightly too tall. Outside, somewhere past the hull of the station, past the docking bay and the transit corridors and the amber light of the outer field, the debris of Kepler colony drifted in the dark of that sector. 2,400 pieces. She knew the number the way she knew her own name. She had not looked at it through the transit window. She had already said what she came to say. The tunnel people had built a monument in 47 words that, in rough translation, those who were here and are not and should not be forgotten and will not be. She thought that was about right. Owen came back with the thermos, warm. Again the cap sealed. He handed it over. He stood beside her in the corridor and they both looked at the unremarkable ceiling. They are going to deliberate for a long time, he said. Yes. What do you think they will decide? She took a drink of hot water that was almost coffee. I think they will build a new category, she said. I think it will take them a while and it will be imperfect, and some of the 11 species will resist it and some will not. And eventually it will be filed under something that does not fully capture what happened in there today. And the alliances will stand, and the grief practices will stand. He was quiet for a moment. And us. She looked at him, young from Bristol, carrying the look she hoped he kept. We will stand, she said. She started walking toward the docking bay. He fell into step beside her. The station moved around them, 11 species going about the business of 4,000 years of civilization, she counted. Exits out of habit. 3 in this corridor, 1 ahead, 2 branching left. She walked through the middle of it with her thermos and her notebook and her one bag and her flat level voice and her 2,400 names and the 3 words she had put down in the middle of that chamber like a foundation stone. Not forgetting, not forgiving the forgetting, not releasing the council from a weight they should carry. Just choosing clearly with full knowledge of the cost to be on the other side of it. That was the thing none of their surveys had measured. That was the thing 4,000 years of civilizational framework had no category for. Not that humans were strong. That humans chose. Every time in the cold, in the dark, in the debris fields and the treaty rooms, in the jury-rigged seats of ships built for 4-armed species, in the notebooks full of names and the thermoses full of something almost but not quite coffee, in all the small and enormous things that made up the shape of a species that had come from a hostile planet and decided against every reasonable expectation to keep showing up. They chose. The docking bay opened ahead. Maravas walked through.